You are listening to I Am Refocused Radio with your host, Shamaya Reed. This show is designed to inspire you to live your purpose and regain your focus. And now, here's your host, Shamaya Reed.
Welcome back to I Am Refocused Radio. We are here again, and man, today we have a true honor. We are going to talk to the one and only filmmaker and best-selling author, Dinesh D'Souza, and all about his latest film, The Dragon's Prophecy, based on Jonathan Cahn's book. It dives into moral and biblical dimensions of October 7th and what it reveals about good, evil, and the battle for the human soul. I had the pleasure to watch this film. It was very powerful, and I just want to say thank you for taking some time this morning to be on with us. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, and thank you for having me on. I'm very excited about this film. It's a departure from my earlier films, which have really focused on politics, culture, and history, but not so much on the Bible or spirituality. And second, they've been very much focused on the meaning of America, whereas this film is really about the great struggle between God and, the dragon. That the dragon in the title refers to the devil. It's a reference to the book of Revelation, chapter 12. And it's an application of that kind of grand biblical framework to events going on around us from October 7th, the Middle East, the Trump peace plan. The idea here is that these aren't just ordinary events. They are in some ways biblical events.
When you think about what first drew you to this project and think about the story of the Dragon's Prophecy, what convinced you that this should be made into a film?
A decade ago, I did a series of debates about God versus atheism against prominent atheists, people like Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins. I wrote 3 books on Christian apologetics, but interestingly, I was not familiar with the very recent advances in biblical archeology, which have the impact of supporting the historicity of the Bible. In other words, for many, many centuries, you got these figures in the Bible, Pontius Pilate, the prophets Isaiah or Jeremiah, King David, and they were in the Bible, but they were only in the Bible. You couldn't find them attested externally until now. We have seen coming out of the ground coins and stone inscriptions and clay seals, all kinds of artifacts. And suddenly figures out of the Bible are jumping out of the Bible, like into the pages of history along the pathway of archeology. So I was very excited by all this. Then comes October 7th. Then comes Jonathan Cahn. And so I realized that here is a way to tie the past, the archaeology, with the present, October 7th and the war. And then Kahn's prophetic angle on all this, that's the future, into a beautiful tapestry. So I'm very proud of the sort of scope of this film. I think it's very much fitting. It fits in with this mood of renewal that we see, not just from the peace plan, but also from the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination. I want the film to be part of a moral and spiritual renewal in the country and worldwide.
Once again, this is I Am Refocused Radio, talking to our guest today, Dinesh D'Souza. If you want to learn more about this film, go to the website, thedragonsprophecyfilm.com. It is available right now on Salem Now. So my next question for you is, in your own words, when I watched the film, like I said earlier in the intro, you were in Israel, you were interviewing survivors, you were getting some very powerful stories. What were some of the most eye-opening things that you discovered as you learn more about some of the people that were affected by October 7th?
Well, it was very moving for me to go to many of the sites that were ransacked, invaded on October 7th. And I mean the Nova Festival site, the site of the kibbutzes where the Hamas terrorists came over, many of them on motorcycles going right across the fence from Gaza, and talked to survivors who gave very harrowing accounts of what happened to them. And very interestingly, we had the actual footage, because it was taken by Hamas, of those events, so we could have them talking about it. And you can see not what I normally do in a film, a recreation of the event, but no, you're watching the actual footage. I also have October 7th opening the movie, and I put you right on the scene. What makes the thing so, I think, kind of eerie is because you're not seeing it from the Israel side. You're seeing it from the Hamas side, because Hamas was the one that took the footage. They live streamed some of it. We have all of it. We excluded some of the most brutal footage, but we have enough in there where you really get a feeling of what it was like. And then we pull back and look at these events in their wide significance. Political questions like whose land is it? The critique that Israel is like a colonizing power, the claims now from some of these people on the right who are very anti-Israel, anti-Jewish. We take all of that on. The film is very timely in a way, but it's also timeless because it doesn't get stuck in the mud. It is able to look at things in a kind of broad perspective, and there are biblical passages brought up, as you know, having seen it up on the screen, so that things aren't just asserted about the Bible. You can actually see them, and we use, by the way, cutting edge AI to illustrate some of the ancient scenes, like the pilgrimage road where Mary and Joseph lost Jesus. You can kind of see what that was like. I'm standing archaeologically in the ruins of it, but then through AI, you see what that was actually like in the 1st century AD.
And when you think about protests, that it still goes on even to today, even from starting of October 7th, people protesting from the river to the sea, you break that down in the film as well, the meaning behind that. If you can, for our audience, what is the meaning of that from the biblical context?
Well, this is where Jonathan Cahn, who wrote the book called The Dragon's Prophecy, comes in. And he does a minute study of the Bible, and he is able, with great insight, to draw parallels. So he points out, for example, that God gives Abraham and his descendants the land, quote, from the river to the sea. The phrase, almost the exact same phrase, appears in the Bible. And yet that phrase is now inverted to imply that Israel should exit the land from the river to the sea, and all that land belongs to the Arabs, who have decided really very much in recent years to call themselves Palestinians. The other point that Cahn makes is the name Hamas, which in Arabic means something like force or strength. Very interestingly, in Hebrew, it means violence. And if you look at the Hebrew scriptures in the Hebrew, it says things like, Lord, save me from the men of Hamas, or Hamas dwells in the dark places of the earth, the actual word appearing in the Bible. So Cahn is able to provide a kind of flashing biblical insight so that we can look at these things. And if it was just one thing, you'd go, well, maybe that's a coincidence. Maybe that's just interesting. But he draws it out so elaborately that I think you leave the theater and you're like, wow, there's a lot for me to think about. And that's really what a good film does. It doesn't actually supply ready-made answers. It shows you a lot of things you didn't know. It draws on your head and heart, both your mind and your emotions. It has beautiful music. Of course, I have a one-on-one with the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, and I ask him really interesting questions about, hey, Tucker Carlson raised the question of whether the Jews of today, like the Jews of your country now, are they in fact the descendants of the ancient Israelites? And Netanyahu, of course, jumps right in and gives a very elegant sort of dunking on Tucker, but draws out his own family history in that region. So the film, as I say, moves back and forth from the timely to the timeless. It's actually a lot timelier now than when I even made the film, but just because it happens to have, well, we think the timing is somewhat providential.
The Dragon's Prophecy is available, like I said earlier, on sale now. You can go learn more about the film at thedragonsprophecyfilm.com. My next question for you, Dinesh, is how did you approach the balancing of history, Bible, real world conflict on the screen? That had to been a challenging task.
Well, the difficulty is to figure out how to weave the tapestry together. And the other difficulty is this. I mean, I'm very comfortable in the political terrain. I had to tread cautiously in the biblical terrain because even though I've written about these subjects, I haven't treated them before cinematically. Jonathan Cahn speaks primarily to an audience that already accepts the authority of the Bible, but I have a mixed audience, a lot of secular people, and some people are going to say to me, well, yeah, Dinesh, but as you know, there's been in a school of criticism since the 19th century, which says, these figures in the Bible, if they're not like made up, they're embellished. The Bible was written hundreds of years later after the fact. And this is why I have the section on biblical archaeology, in which I jump into the archaeological pit. And why? Because what I want to show is that the archaeology is actually ratifying not just major figures in the Bible, it's doing that, but very minor figures in the Bible that you couldn't possibly have known hundreds of years later. It would be like something like 300 years from now, asking someone to make up a bunch of stuff about today and give the names of the interns in the White House who are working with Trump. Well, who would be able to do that? So archaeology ratifies, for example, the guy who was the royal steward and cook for King Hosea. This is like in the 6th or 7th century BC. There are a couple of dudes mentioned in the book of Jeremiah. They appear like once or twice there. You could call them cameo appearances in the Bible. Out come clay seals in the ground around the city of David, about 53 clay seals, but 2 of them name these 2 guys. One is Jehukal, son of Shelemiah, Gedaliah, son of Pashur. And in fact, the people who found the seals had no idea that these people are actually in the Bible. Someone had to look it up and go, whoa, these people are mentioned in, I believe it's the book of Samuel or the book of Kings. And so again, suddenly the Bible is corroborated, not just at the macro level, but at the micro level of little details.
When viewers go see this film and they see the footage from October 7th, what do you hope that they will understand better looking through the lens of that event? And how does the film challenge the way artisans may think about good and evil in modern times?
So October 7th, I think, even putting aside for a moment the Bible, you can see there's something a little unique about this if you think about it. Because it is very odd for someone to do these atrocities and be really proud of it. So that was Hamas. They filmed it, they live stream it. We have a call in the film where a guy who has actually killed a bunch of Jews is calling his mom and dad and basically saying, put mom on, I'm a hero, I just killed 10 Jews. And you might expect the parents to be like, oh my God. But they're like, Allahu Akbar, wonderful, wonderful son, we're so proud of you. So you see right here something that requires a little bit of processing, because I think psychologically it's a little difficult for us to grasp. Even the Nazis, by the way, in World War II, who did tremendous atrocities, they hid them. The death camps were all placed outside of Germany, in occupied Poland or the occupied territories. Why? Because the Nazis were like, we don't want the German people to see this. But this contrasts with Hamas, which is like, we want our people to see this. We think that this is going to enhance our reputation in Gaza, maybe also in the so-called West Bank. So right there, again, in a purely secular terms, you realize we're dealing with evils of a dimension that we haven't really seen before. This requires some natural explanation. And if the natural explanation is inadequate, well, maybe we need a supernatural explanation.
You mentioned earlier talking to Netanyahu and other great figures in the film as well, including Mike Huckabee. When you think about and reflect on some of the insight that you were able to gain from those conversations, are there any things that kind of stick out more than a lot?
Well, this sticks out with me. So one of the ways I get people to open up in a conversation is I hit them with a question that they would never expect. So my question for Netanyahu was, what's your take on Jesus? So I recognize this is a little bit of an explosive question. I'm asking a Jew who's the head of a Jewish state to comment on like the most famous Jew of all time, right? And you could see that Netanyahu, there's like a look of surprise comes across his face, but he quickly recovers, and he actually says something extremely interesting. He emphasizes the Jewishness of Jesus. Jesus is Yeshua. His mom is Miriam. His dad is Yosef. Jesus is, he keeps the Jewish holidays. He bathes in the pool of Siloam, the ritual bath in the city of David. He walks up the pilgrimage road to the temple. So what this represents for me, and I think it's kind of new, you wouldn't have gotten this from Netanyahu 10 years ago, is an attempt on the part of the state of Israel to embrace Jesus and Christians, not theologically, but culturally and historically. They're saying he's one of us. And so there's a bridge building effort here on the part of Netanyahu, which I really appreciate, because I think Christians have strongly supported Israel. Of course, a lot of people are now saying, well, the Jews don't like us. They reject Jesus. They kill Jesus. Now, here's my point about all that. First of all, we are hearing from some people on the right that the Jews of today are not the Jews of the Bible. They're not descended from those Jews. And my point is, all right, let's say that's true. It's not true, but let's say it's true. How can you blame the Jews for killing Jesus? If the Jews of today have nothing to do with the Jews of the Bible, they have no responsibility whatsoever for killing, and yet you continue to maintain that they did. So we're seeing, I think, in our time, from the left and from the right, some rather disturbing currents of anti-Semitism. And I'm very reluctant to use that word. I carefully define it in the movie as judging Jews and Israel by a standard that you would never apply to anybody else. That's the kind of like working definition of it. So the movie, I think, is very careful in the way that it deals with these issues. It's also careful in the way it treats the Bible. There are a lot of people who will look at the book of Revelation and they'll go, this is what's going to come first, and then 3 days later, this is going to happen, and then 7 years later, this is going to happen. We don't do that, because I think the book of Revelation is too mystical. It's too veiled to be able to say this stuff with high degree of certainty. And maybe we're not supposed to know it in that kind of detail. So we touch upon like the big landmarks, like the return of the Jews to their ancient homeland. That's predicted in the Bible. That's a big one. And hey, that happened. So we can verify it. We can corroborate the prophecy with our own eyes. I want to thank you for sharing the website, by the way. It is thedragonsprophecyfilm.com. The film is now in streaming. It's also streaming, by the way, on Rumble. And it is also available on DVD. So I think it's a film that you should see. It will have a profound effect on you, and it will really leave you thinking. And I also hope it'll leave you spiritually edified. It's a film that takes you to some dark places, which you alluded to, October 7th, like the MO of the dragon. But it doesn't leave you there. It leaves you on a note of restoration, unity, renewal. So ultimately, I think the film is something that will leave you with it has very positive things to give you at the end.
And for those who are just tuning in, talking to our guest today, Dinesh D'Souza, one quick question for you again is, when you think of viewers, people that might feel skeptical of prophecy or religion, what do you hope this film could trigger and maybe make them pause and think twice?
What the film does is it brings in the prophetic insights, but it does so in a manner that you can observe for yourself. And so, for example, it is prophesied that in the end times, there will be a massive resurgence of hatred and violence toward the Jews. Why? For the simple reason that if the Jews are the chosen people, who do you think Satan is going to target except them? But not only them. Why? Because in addition to the Jews, you have what can be called the spiritual Israelites, the people who have been engrafted into the covenant. This is the Christians. And so again, if the Bible is right, there will be an attack not only on the Jews, but there will be rising tides of persecution against Christians occurring in the world. So then the film just says, all right, let's look around the world and see if that's happening. Because if it's not happening, then we probably are not approaching the end times. But if it is happening, you might want to think how a book written centuries, if in some cases thousands of years ago, could have anticipated and foreseen these momentous events that we happen to see occurring all around us. So this is the tone in which the film approaches these topics. And for this reason, I think it appeals to Christians, to Jews, and to secular people alike.
Last quick final question for you is, at the end of the film, there is a powerful call to action for Jews and Christians. If you can, for our audience, what do you think that will look like in everyday life?
Jonathan Cahn makes the point that in some way things are going back to the beginning. The Palestinians, they're not genetically the same people as the Philistines. The film never claims that, but they have taken the ancient name of the Philistines, and they use the barbaric tactics of the Philistines. And so the people of Israel now have had to put on armor. I mean, it's very interesting to be in Israel. You have 19-year-olds and 20-year-olds with battle gear. They're holding these machine guns. So Israel has had to go back to the way it was like in 3000 BC. And the message of the film is that Christians need to do that too. Why? Because some of these radical Islamists, they still have the force of Islam's original revelation. It's almost like the part of them lives in the 7th century. Well, the message to Christians is a little part of us needs to live in the 1st century AD, meaning we need to have some of the fervor and the zeal of the Christians in the book of Acts, who are like on fire for the Lord, eager to spread the message, putting on the spiritual armor, willing to take on the dragon, unafraid of taking sides in the battle of good and evil. So this is where the film is going. It's ultimately not even so much a film about what's happening over there. It's about what is happening in the great clash for your human soul and the importance of you making a decision and siding with good versus evil, siding with God over the dragon.
Been talking to Dinesh D'Souza here on Refocused Radio. Make sure you go support the project, The Dragon's Prophecy. Go to the website, thedragonprophecyfilm.com. It is available streaming on sale now. Like always, I want to say to you, sir, thank you for your time.
I really appreciate it.